Hello and welcome to the Print pre-budget show. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor, and this is Yuthika Bhargava, Associate Editor. And we're going to be running you through what the context is for this budget, what are the key demands, what is likely to happen, what might not happen, in what way it'll happen. But before we start all of that, let me then give you the lay of the land. What is the context for this budget? So now the number one thing to keep in mind is that the difference between this budget and the interim budget that FM Sitaraman announced in February is that they have this giant surplus dividend that has come from the RBI. Now let me tell you how giant this actually is. So in the interim budget, the government had said that it would get 1.02 lakh crore from the RBI and the PSU banks taken together. The RBI itself has transferred 2.1 lakh crore. This is not counting the PSU banks. So suddenly the government finds itself with this surplus amount and it has to decide how to spend it. That's on the non-tax revenue side. On the tax revenue side, in FY24, it found that the actual tax revenue it earned was about 27% higher than what it had budgeted at the start of the year. So this year as well, it said that it'll get about 2.6 lakh crore in the interim budget, but this is likely to be higher given that last year also they got quite a bit higher. So that's another area where they have a little fiscal space to play around with. Now, the fiscal deficit at the start of last year was targeted at 5.8%. And because of these increased revenues and all of that, they were able to bring it down to 5.6. So that's 0.2 percentage points lower than what they had budgeted. For FY25, in the interim budget, they said that it will be 5.1% of GDP, but now we'll go into a little later, we'll go into what this actually likely will be. The fourth thing to keep in mind between the interim budget and the final budget is the political change that has happened. Between these two budgets has been the general election, and as we know, the BJP failed to reach the single party majority mark and so had to form a coalition government with the help of its allies. This is quite important running into the final budget because it'll inform a lot of the decisions. There's a lot of talk that there might be some populist measures. The alliance partners have their demands. So all of that also informs the budget that is going to be presented right after we finish this show. Finally, there's also the great unemployment problem. Now, don't go into the numbers. I'm not going to go into the numbers that, the government's data is saying this, CMI is saying this, IMF is saying that, World Bank is saying something else. Forget the numbers. Just look around you, look at the news. You'll see that there is a jobs crisis, something that we cannot hide from, something that we cannot ignore. So that's another thing, that's another context for this budget. But now that I've laid out this situation, Yuthika, could you tell us a little more? Now, the finance minister has held a lot of pre-budget consultations, and the industry has had a lot of suggestions for them. So, could you tell us a snapshot of the main things that they are asking for?
Sure. So, on a larger level, like you said about the elections, the industry and analysts both are divided. Some are saying there could be some populist measures because of the election results, but largely majority is saying there may not be populist measures and the government would want to stick to their fiscal targets.
Right.
That's on a larger level, but they do have certain demands that they're expecting from this budget.
Okay.
Firstly, although like on GST, although they acknowledge that GST is not something that the government can do something
Yeah, it's the
about,
GST Council.
GST Council, but they want that there should be at least some guidance from the government that they want to simplify the structure a bit,
Right.
come to a more of a three tax rate structure, one low for essential goods, one standard for most goods, and just one high for demerit luxury goods. That is a sort of guidance that they are looking for from the government. Then they have some suggestions on disinvestment. They have said that traditionally what the government does is it selects PSUs that it wants to disinvest in, and then it goes to and seeks interests.
Right.
We don't get interest and the process gets delayed.
Absolutely.
So industry has suggested that this should be reversed. First seek interest from the industry and see which PSUs are getting interest,
I
which
see.
PSUs are getting higher valuations, and then you put those PSUs for disinvestment first. And this can also help in creating a roadmap for 3 years.
Right.
They can do that. So this is
Okay.
one of the areas where.
Right. And so now, I mean, disinvestment is, of course, it's a key point because if you remember during the pandemic in 2020, May 2020, they announced their Atmanirbhar Bharat plan, within which was their public sector enterprises policy. This had two key points. One was that in strategic sectors, the government would maintain a minimum presence, but just a minimum presence. And in all non strategic sectors, the government very clearly said that it would absolutely exit those sectors, complete privatization in those sectors. So now this, of course, has not happened. As Yuthika has
Mhm.
pointed out, there's not been a lot of interest from the industry in buying a lot of these PSUs. Things like IDBI Bank, that has been the disinvestment process has been languishing for a long time. So I don't see the government really increasing the disinvestment target this year. It might keep it at what it had set in the interim budget, or it might even lower it, because they've also been talking about how they've been getting a lot of dividends from these public sector
Mm.
enterprises. So the strategy does seem to be moving from making money not from selling the companies, but making money by turning these companies around and earning more dividends. So yes, Yutika.
Yeah. Another thing that industry is saying is that capital expenditure, which was already increased
Mhm.
in the interim budget to 11 lakh crore, that should be increased further. They, according to them, 11 lakh crore is not sufficient. There
Okay.
needs to be more capex, and major a focus of this capex should be in the rural areas, creating infrastructure for irrigation,
Mhm.
cold chain, storage, and that should be the focus.
Because it is the rural area that is
Yeah.
facing distress.
Yes. And they also want, in addition to this, they also want that some sort of demand should be created there.
Mhm.
People disposable incomes should be increased so that consumption is increased, and one of the ways to do that they have suggested is cutting
Fuel taxes.
fuel taxes.
Okay.
Not they there are not there are no great suggestions for cutting income tax rates and giving more standard deductions, or they have focused on fuel tax more.
Right. I guess that makes sense because in the end, only about 5% of all Indians
Yeah.
file income tax returns, and just 1% actually pays tax. Most of them are filing zero
Zero
returns.
returns.
So fuel is something that will affect a lot more people, and so that does make sense.
And then there are some measures to help industry in terms of ease of doing business. They want that cost of doing business should be reduced. For example, national logistics policy that
Right.
should be timely implemented. Logistic cost will come down, which will help the industry. The industry also wants that there should be a separate department or a ministry handling investments. Industry says that, right
Okay.
now, if you want to put in some investment, you have to get multiple clearance. First, you have to go to Home Ministry, then you have to go to Finance Ministry.
Mhm.
You have different departments, RBI, SEBI, a lot of approvals. So, this Ministry of Investment that they have
Right.
proposed, that should be one shop, like one clearance window for the industry, is what they have suggested.
That's interesting because right now, technically, the nodal agency is DPAM under the Finance Ministry, which is the Department of Investment and Public Asset
Yeah.
Management. But if there is a new ministry created, and it's not a new thing for this government
Hmm.
to create a new ministry. It created the Ministry of Cooperation not too long ago. So a Ministry of Investment could totally be on the cards, but that would mean that then DPAM would come out of the Ministry of Finance and might be incorporated into this new
Could be.
ministry.
But that can that be done? Is or has that
Absolutely,
been
that
done?
can be done because even again, just I think last year or the year before that, they took in the Department of Public Enterprises.
Hmm.
They incorporated that within the Ministry of Finance. So it can be done. It's
Hmm.
just it's an administrative thing,
And some of the other demands are measures to boost affordable housing.
right?
Although we have seen Pradhan Mantri
The Awas
Awas
Yojana,
Yojana for both rural urban, but there should be more measures to boost affordable housing and allocations for education and healthcare. They have suggested that they should be increased. One very interesting thing they have mentioned is that investments in R&D for India are very less,
right?
and those should go up. They have given numbers. They've said like right now about 0.67% of GDP is goes into R&D,
Hmm.
and this should be brought up to at least 4%. But they have not said that this should be done immediately. By 2047 this should be taken up to
Okay.
4%. Maybe this year in budget we could take it to 1.25%.
But then, so these are suggestions
Yeah.
for the government. The economic survey, on the other hand, has completely blasted the private
Yes.
sector, and one of the things that it said is that you are not investing in intellectual property, which is R and
Which is
D.
R&D.
And so you have this little dichotomy: industry is saying government should do it, government is saying that industry should do it.
Definitely, but who will do it, we'll
But
have
who
to
will do it?
see.
Somebody needs to do it.
Yes, definitely, because we global average is for developed countries 4 to 5% at least
Right.
minimum goes
And if
into
we want to be a
R&D.
developed country by 2047, as the
47
PM
we,
says,
yeah,
then
so
it
we
should
need
reach, yeah,
4%. So in somehow we need to look at
increase it. Yeah,
this.
whoever does it, somebody needs to do it.
Needs to do it. That is, and they also need, they also are seeking, although government is working a new policy on AI, but they say that this
Mhm.
policy should not be like a short term one. It should at least give you a framework for a decade at least
Right.
to go on with.
Okay, so that's quite a micro look at what industry wants, but again, from the macro side, just looking at the broad numbers, I can tell you some things that are likely, some things that economists are talking about, what should happen, what shouldn't happen. So let's look at the RBI surplus. Now, you have on one side, you have people like Neelkant Mishra of Axis Bank, who's saying that this RBI dividend is a one time gain for the government. And so it should go towards a one time expenditure, which is to reduce the deficit. Now, the thing is that reducing the deficit has several advantages to it. One is, of course, that the lower the deficit, that means that the government needs to borrow less to finance this deficit, which has a bearing, by the way, on you and me, because if the government is borrowing less, that means eventually it has to pay less in terms of interest on these loans, which means that our tax money, the money that you and I are paying through GST, income tax, all of that, that can go towards more productive uses rather than just paying off interest on loans. And the other thing is that a lower fiscal deficit also is a major indicator of fiscal discipline. And this is important because ratings agencies look at this very carefully. And so if we reduce our fiscal deficit in as a percentage of GDP by a decent amount, from 5.1, say, from the target that was set in the interim budget, if we make it 4.9, in any case the government has said that they want to bring it to 4.5% by FY26. If we manage to do this, there's a high chance that we'll get a ratings upgrade. And what this means is that it'll create a new paradigm for India's borrowing program, because we'll then be able to borrow at lower interest rates, which again then comes back to the same point that we'll have to pay less to pay off our loans, which means our tax revenue can go towards a lot more productive things. It also means that companies can borrow at lower cost, which is great for them because that might induce them to invest more. So all of this is on the pro side of reducing the fiscal deficit. But on the con side, as economists like Radhika Pandey have pointed out, the the issue about jobs and demand
Hmm.
creation is a very big one. So the government should actually strike a balance. It's not as if it should discard its fiscal deficit targets and just go for broke, but it should also focus on demand and job creation. One of the suggestions that she has is that along with the production linked incentive schemes, they should also come up with an employment linked incentive scheme in various sectors, so that you're encouraging companies to come and invest and will give you incentives only so long as you employ these many people. And isn't that something that even the industry was asking
Yeah,
about?
actually, this demand, not just industry, analyst, economist, everybody has said that, given success that some of the PLIs have seen, employment linked incentive could really work, especially in sectors which are labor intensive, like, tourism, hospitality.
Right.
These are the sectors that can generate employment. So this
Absolutely.
is one thing that everybody has asked for.
Okay, so then it might be something that's on the cards, because the this government is quite responsive to especially what industry is asking
Yeah.
for. So we might see this. Then coming to politics, as we talked about, it's a coalition government and the allies have their various demands. Both Nitish Kumar and Chandrababu Naidu have their favorite projects that they want the center to help finance, or maybe even finance completely. So we will likely see some allocations towards this in the budget. So some of this surplus you might see going in that direction. Political compulsions are important ones, you can't ignore them. And so that's one thing. Then there's something that the economic survey mentioned, the finance minister has mentioned, the RBI has mentioned, and SEBI has also brought up, and this is concern about futures and options trading in India. Now, how it's happening at such a large level right now, and how even the stock market, the market capitalization now is at 140% of GDP, and how this is not a sign of strength. This is actually a sign of instability and fragility. And how, especially in the derivatives market,
Hmm.
when there is a market crash, it particularly hurts those people who are trading in derivatives. So this is something that we can see in the budget. If so many of the top regulators, the minister, the chief economic advisor, all of them are raising this concern, we could see an increase in the capital gains tax, particularly on the futures and options side. We could see some changes to the securities transaction tax. These are various things that could happen, and they're likely to happen, because given the level of concern that is being expressed. Then we come to income taxes. Now, I know that the industry hasn't
Hmm.
really asked for too many cuts on the income tax side. But the thing is that this is, of course, a favorite demand of households, of you and me. We'd love to see this happen. It hasn't happened in a long time. But the thing is that if you remember, in FY20, the government introduced the new tax regime, where it said that we'll do away with exemptions and we'll give you lower tax rates. The government wants you to move to this new tax regime. It wants to do away with exemptions. So I don't see them increasing exemption limits in the old regime
Hmm.
or reducing rates in the old regime. If there is any relaxation, it will happen in the new regime. So they'll make it more attractive for all of us to move to this new regime, because it's a cleaner, easier, simpler tax regime where there are no exemptions, it's just lower rates. And finally, on capital expenditure, I know industry is asking for an increase in capital expenditure. And in fact, I saw one of them saying that it should increase from the 3.4% of GDP right now, it should go up to as much as 10% of GDP. Now, this to me seems unrealistic, because while the government has been increasing its capital expenditure, the growth every year has been lower and lower, because there's only so much that the government can do. And even
Hmm.
the government has said this, and even the economic survey has pointed out that while it's the job for the government to create infrastructure and to create linkages and connectivity, it is now time for the private sector to take this ahead and push forward with capital investments. So that is a very strong indication about the way that the government is thinking about these things. Yutika, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Just on the capital tax structure that you mentioned, capital gain tax structure. some of the analysts are saying that this could be simplified. They are
Right.
saying that right now it's very
It
complicated,
is.
multiple rates for different capital assets
Yeah.
and
Short term
holding
capital gains
period.
and long term capital
Yeah.
gains. Absolutely.
So this could be simplified is largely it. And for PLI, like, people are generally happy, so they just want that
More
more
sectors,
sectors should be included in
especially the
PLI,
employment generation ones, right? So,
toys and
yeah.
etc. So that's largely it.
Okay, so there you go. The government is in a comfortable fiscal space, but it has various uh, priorities that it needs to juggle. Some of them are political, some of them are economic. The jobs crisis is something it needs to pay attention to, but also it can't throw fiscal consolidation out of the window. It needs to particularly be careful about this, especially now that government bonds are included in international indices. Globally, you're going to have companies, ratings agencies, and governments increasingly scrutinizing our numbers. So we can't suddenly become more
Hmm.
imprudent or more irresponsible. We're going to have to stick to the consolidation plan, but there is that little leeway. How the government will spend it? Will it cut tax rates, income tax rates? Will it simplify rate structures? Will it spend more on capital expenditure? Will it spend more on projects that are close to, that are the favorites of their allies? These are all the things that we can look forward to in the budget speech that's going to start shortly at 11 a.m. But on that note, that's all from us. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for joining us.